James loved the tranquility of his lakeside home. Nestled at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, the house had everything he could ever want: a picturesque view of the water, a cozy backyard, and most importantly, a small heated pool he had installed a couple of years ago. While the lake was perfect for swimming in the summer, the water turned bone-chillingly cold in the fall and early spring. That's when the heated pool became his refuge. The pool wasn't extravagant, just a modest-sized setup with a deck and a couple of sun loungers. For James, it was a luxury worth every penny. He often spent weekends lounging by the pool with a cold drink in hand, escaping from the world and its endless demands. The water was always warm, inviting, and blissfully free of noisy crowds, a stark contrast to the bustling lake nearby. That afternoon was no different. The sun was out, and the early spring breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms from the nearby trees. James had just finished a leisurely swim in his pool when nature called. Leaving his towel on the lounge chair and his hat and sunscreen next to it, he headed inside to use the restroom, intending to return in a few minutes. But as he reached for a glass of water in the kitchen, his phone rang. It was his brother, calling with an urgent request for some information from James's computer. "Hey, can you check something for me real quick?" his brother asked. Real quick turned into a 30-minute detour. James didn't think much of it at first. After all, the pool was right outside, and the backyard was fenced. What could possibly go wrong? As the phone call dragged on, James leaned back in his chair, occasionally glancing out the window. The pool shimmered in the afternoon light, still uncovered and waiting for him to return. He made a mental note to get back outside as soon as the call ended. Finally, after what felt like forever, the conversation wrapped up. He stretched, took a sip of water, and made his way back outside. The scene that greeted him was something out of a bizarre dream. A woman, perhaps in her early 40s, with sunglasses perched on her head and an air of entitlement radiating from her very presence, was lounging on his sun chair. His towel, hat, and sunscreen had been unceremoniously dumped onto the grass beside her. Meanwhile, a boy, probably 8 or 9 years old, splashed happily in his pool as if he owned the place. For a moment, James thought he might be hallucinating. He blinked, trying to process what he was seeing. Was he on some hidden camera show? Did he unknowingly sign up for a neighborhood pool-sharing program? After a few seconds of standing in stunned silence, reality caught up with him. This woman and her kid had trespassed onto his property and were casually enjoying his pool without a shred of shame. James cleared his throat, drawing the woman's attention. Excuse me," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Why are you on my property?" The woman turned to him with a look of mild annoyance, as though he had interrupted something important. "Oh," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "Is this your property?" James stared at her, struggling to believe the absurdity of the question. "Yes. This is my property. Why are you here?" The woman crossed her legs and leaned back, speaking in a tone one might use to explain something obvious to a child. "You see, my son wanted to go for a swim, but the lake was a little too cold." "Isn't that right, sweetheart?" she said, glancing at her son, who was too busy swimming to care. James felt his patience slipping. "The lake is cold, but that doesn't explain why you're on my property, using my pool," he said, his tone turning colder by the second. The woman sighed, clearly unimpressed with his reaction. "There's no need to be rude," she said. "I'm just trying to keep my kid happy." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I'm sorry, but I don't let strangers use my things." "You need to leave," he said firmly. Turning to the boy, he added, "Buddy, you need to get out of the pool." That seemed to be the wrong move. The woman shot to her feet, her eyes blazing with indignation. "How dare you talk to my child like that?" she shrieked. "He has feelings too. He deserves to be in that pool. Plus, if you make him get out now, he could get hypothermia. Is that what you want? For my child to get sick?" James stood there, utterly dumbfounded. He couldn't decide whether to laugh or be angry. "Look," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the ridiculousness of the situation. "It's a warm day. There's no way he's getting hypothermia from swimming in this pool. And more importantly, he has no right to be here. This is my property, and you both need to leave before I call the cops." For a moment, James thought she might back down. Instead, the woman crossed her arms and smirked. "Good," she said. "Go ahead and call the cops. I'll just tell them you threatened my child and harassed me. Let's see how that works out for you." James clenched his jaw, trying to keep his cool. Before he could respond, the woman raised a hand to silence him. Then, in a syrupy sweet voice, she turned to her son and said, It's okay, honey. This mean man just wasn't raised to be a caring person. I'll raise you better. James blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. The audacity of this woman was beyond anything he'd ever encountered. Taking a deep breath, he prepared himself for what was clearly going to be a long, frustrating conversation. Little did he know, the situation was about to escalate in ways he never expected. James stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on the woman who had just accused him of being heartless in front of her son. The nerve of her. He had encountered difficult people in the past, but this woman was in a league of her own. If there were an Olympic event for entitlement, she would have been the gold medalist. He took a deep breath, determined not to lose his temper. Listen, James said, his tone as measured as he could manage. I'm asking you one last time. Please get your things and leave. You're on private property, and you have no right to be here. The woman tilted her head and smirked. Wow, someone's touchy about their little pool. It's not like we're hurting anyone, right? My son is just swimming. You should be happy to share with the neighborhood kids. James clenched his fists at his sides, trying to remain calm. Share? Neighborhood kids? He'd never seen this woman before in his life. This isn't a public pool, he said firmly. And even if it were, you don't just walk onto someone's property without asking. That's trespassing. The woman rolled her eyes. Oh, come on. It's just a pool. You're overreacting. We'll be gone in a little while. Why don't you go back inside and relax? Relax, James repeated, his voice rising despite himself. You've thrown my stuff on the ground, taken over my chair, and let your kid into my pool without permission. And now you want me to just relax? Karen crossed her arms. Exactly. No harm done, right? My son's happy, and that should matter, shouldn't it? At that moment, James felt the last shred of his patience snap. No, what matters is that this is my home. I don't know you. I don't know your son. And frankly, I don't care how cold the lake is. You both need to leave now, or I'm calling the cops. For a second, he thought he might have gotten through to her. But the woman's eyes lit up with defiance, and a twisted smile spread across her face. Fine, she said, stepping closer. Call the cops. I'll tell them you threatened my son. That should make for an interesting story, don't you think? James narrowed his eyes. You do realize I have security cameras, right? It was a bluff, he hadn't installed them yet. But he delivered the lie with confidence, hoping it would spook her. Every second of this is being recorded. So if you want to tell the cops a story, go right ahead. I'm sure they'll love seeing the footage of you trespassing. That seemed to give her pause. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Cameras? She repeated, glancing around as if searching for the supposed surveillance system. James nodded. Yep. Cameras. So unless you want this whole thing to blow up in your face, I suggest you take your son and leave. Karen's bravado faltered, but only for a moment. She quickly recovered, flipping her hair and laughing dismissively. You're bluffing. There aren't any cameras. James didn't respond right away. Instead, he crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow, silently daring her to test him. He knew it was a gamble, but it seemed to be working. The longer he stood there, the more uncomfortable she looked. Her son, still oblivious to the tension, continued splashing around in the pool. Mom, look. I can do a handstand, he shouted, kicking his legs into the air. Karen turned to him with a strained smile. That's great, sweetheart. Keep practicing. Then, without missing a beat, she looked back at James. Fine. You've made your point. We'll leave. But you don't have to be such a jerk about it. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. A jerk? He had shown more patience than most people would in his situation. But he wasn't about to let her rewrite the narrative. A jerk? He said, his voice calm but laced with sarcasm. I'm not the one trespassing on someone else's property and refusing to leave. Karen ignored him, turning back to her son. Come on, sweetie. This man clearly doesn't know how to share. We'll find a nicer place to swim. Her son pouted. But I like this pool. I know, honey, Karen said, throwing a glance over her shoulder at James. But some people just aren't raised to be generous. James rolled his eyes, biting back a retort. He didn't want to prolong the argument any further. All he cared about was getting them off his property. Let's go, Karen said, grabbing her son's arm. She yanked him out of the pool and wrapped a towel around his shoulders. Then she scooped up her things, the ones she hadn't thrown on the ground, and started toward the gate. But just when James thought it was finally over, Karen stopped at the edge of the yard and turned back around. You know, she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness, you really should be more neighborly. People around here don't like selfish types. James couldn't help but laugh. Selfish? For not letting a random stranger swim in my pool? If that makes me selfish, then I'm happy to be the poster child. Karen glared at him for a long moment before spinning on her heel and walking away, her son trailing behind her. As she reached the gate, she turned one last time and raised her middle finger in the air. "Have a nice day, jerk," she shouted before disappearing down the street. James stood there for a few seconds, watching her go. He was torn between relief and lingering frustration. Part of him wanted to scream. Another part wanted to laugh at the sheer absurdity of what had just happened. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. It was over. For now. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something like this could happen again. With a new sense of determination, he made a mental note to finally install those security cameras. Better safe than sorry. James watched Karen and her son disappear down the street, but something about the way she left didn't sit right with him. That smug look on her face, the way she raised her middle finger in victory. It felt like she hadn't truly accepted defeat. He shook his head, deciding to brush it off. The woman was gone, and the ordeal was over. At least, that's what James thought. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to unwind, but no matter how hard he tried, his mind kept replaying the incident. The entitlement, the lies, the absurdity of the whole situation, it gnawed at him. He finally decided to take a walk down by the lake to clear his head. The fresh air and gentle sound of the water always had a calming effect. As he strolled along the shoreline, he noticed a few families scattered across the beach, kids playing in the sand, and a couple of teenagers tossing a frisbee. For a brief moment, James felt at ease again. This was what he loved about living here, the peaceful simplicity of it all. But his peace was short-lived. From the corner of his eye, James noticed Karen standing at the edge of the beach, talking animatedly to a group of people. His stomach tightened. She was gesturing wildly in the direction of his house, and the group was nodding along, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. It didn't take a detective to figure out what she was saying. She was spinning some ridiculous story about how James had threatened her and her son, painting herself as the victim. James clenched his jaw. He had hoped she would just move on with her life, but clearly Karen wasn't the type to let things go. He debated confronting her, but decided against it. The last thing he needed was to escalate the situation further, especially in front of a crowd. Instead, he turned and headed back home, determined to avoid any more drama. He tried to distract himself with some yard work, but his eyes kept flicking toward the street, half expecting Karen to come storming back. Hours passed, and just as he began to relax, the familiar sound of footsteps on gravel made his heart sink. She was back. Karen stood at the edge of his driveway, her arms crossed and her face set in a smug expression. Behind her was a man James hadn't seen before, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with a stern look on his face. Judging by the way he carried himself, James guessed he was either Karen's husband or some sort of enforcer she had called in to handle the situation. "Hey," Karen called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We need to have a little chat." James sighed, dropping his gardening tools and walking toward her. "I thought we were done here." "Oh, we're far from done," Karen said, tilting her head. "This is my husband, Rob. I told him all about what happened earlier, and he wants to have a word with you." Rob stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he sized James up. "My wife told me you threatened our son," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We don't take kindly to people threatening kids." James stared at Rob, incredulous. "I didn't threaten anyone," he said calmly. "Your wife trespassed on my property and refused to leave. I told her to get off my property, and that's it." Rob crossed his arms. "So you're calling my wife a liar?" James held his ground. "I'm saying she's not telling you the whole story." Karen's eyes widened in mock outrage. "See what I mean, Rob? He's so rude. And now he's accusing me of lying. This is exactly how he treated me earlier." Rob looked between James and Karen, clearly unsure of who to believe. James decided to take a gamble. "Look, if you want to involve the police, be my guest. In fact, I'll call them right now, and we'll see what they have to say about trespassing and false accusations." For a moment, Rob seemed to consider it. Then, to James's surprise, he burst out laughing. "You've got some guts, I'll give you that," Rob said, his demeanor shifting from aggressive to amused. "Honestly, I don't want to get the cops involved. Let's just settle this like adults." Karen's smug expression faltered. Clearly, this wasn't the outcome she had expected. "But Rob," he raised a hand to silence her. "Enough, Karen. You should have asked for permission before jumping into someone else's pool. That's just common sense. James couldn't help but smirk. Finally, a voice of reason. Karen's face turned bright red. But the lake was freezing. And he was so rude. Rob shook his head. I'm sure it was cold, but that doesn't give you the right to trespass. Let's go. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but thought better of it. With an exasperated huff, she turned and marched back toward the street, muttering under her breath. Rob gave James a nod. Sorry about the trouble. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Thanks, James said, watching them walk away. As they disappeared around the corner, he let out a long breath. Hopefully, this really was the end of it. But just as he turned to go back inside, a thought struck him. He glanced at his house and then at the street, his mind already planning his next move. He was done playing defense. It was time to take action. The next morning, James called a security company and scheduled an appointment for a full surveillance system to be installed. Cameras, motion sensors, the works. He wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone else, walk onto his property uninvited again. A few days later, the cameras were up and running. James felt a newfound sense of security as he watched the live feed on his phone. The next time someone tried to pull a stunt like Karen's, he'd have all the evidence he needed. Just as he was settling back into his peaceful routine, a notification popped up on his phone. A motion alert from the front yard. James tapped the screen, and sure enough, there she was. Karen stood at the gate, holding a piece of paper. She slipped it into his mailbox and walked away without looking back. James retrieved the note, half expecting another passive-aggressive jab. But as he unfolded it, he couldn't help but chuckle. Dear James, next time, don't leave your pool uncovered. Temptation is hard to resist. It wasn't an apology, but it was as close as he was going to get. James smiled, shaking his head. Some people never changed. James stood on his front porch, reading the note in disbelief. Karen's audacity knew no bounds. Even after everything, she couldn't just apologize and move on. Instead, she left a veiled jab, wrapped in fake politeness, as if daring him to respond. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. He'd dealt with her once. He could certainly handle her again, if she dared to try. The security cameras gave James a newfound sense of peace. He no longer worried about surprise intrusions or absurd encounters. Every angle of his property was now under surveillance, and the live feed on his phone became a guilty pleasure. He found himself occasionally checking the cameras, half expecting another Karen sighting. But for the next few days, all was quiet. A week later, James was finally back in his rhythm. Spring was in full bloom, and the afternoons were warm and perfect for lounging by the pool. The water shimmered under the sunlight, inviting him for a long swim. He grabbed a book, a cold drink, and stretched out on his lounge chair, savoring the calm that had returned to his little slice of paradise. But just as he started to lose himself in the pages of his book, his phone buzzed. Emotion alert. He tapped the notification, his heart sinking. The live feed from his front yard showed Karen standing at the gate once again, this time holding a large cardboard box. She looked around cautiously, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Then she placed the box on the porch and quickly walked away. James narrowed his eyes. This wasn't just a note. He walked over to the box, half expecting something ridiculous, maybe another passive-aggressive message or some bizarre peace offering. Whatever it was, he wasn't about to take any chances. He crouched down and carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a pile of cheap inflatable pool toys, floaties, beach balls, and even a plastic flamingo. On top of the pile was another note written in Karen's distinct, overly neat handwriting. Thought you might need these since you're so protective of your pool. Enjoy! James burst out laughing. He had to admit, it was creative. Annoying but creative. He leaned against the porch railing, still chuckling as he stared at the box of pool toys. Karen clearly couldn't resist getting the last word, but instead of being irritated, James found the whole thing strangely amusing. He snapped a picture of the box and texted it to his brother. Remember that lady I told you about? She's back with gifts. His phone buzzed almost immediately. His brother replied with a string of laughing emojis and the message, Dude, you've got your own sitcom going on over there. For a moment, James considered tossing the toys into the trash. But then, an idea struck him, a way to turn Karen's petty gesture into something positive. He hauled the box into his backyard and set up a poolside party for one. He inflated the flamingo, tossed the beach balls into the water, and snapped a few photos of his newly accessorized pool. He posted the photos on his neighborhood social media group with the caption, "Thanks to a generous neighbor, my pool is now summer ready. Feel free to admire from a distance." The post quickly gained traction. Comments poured in from amused neighbors who had heard about the original incident. Some joked about wanting to borrow the flamingo, while others shared their own stories of odd encounters with entitled people. One comment caught James's attention in particular. "Karen strikes again. Classic." James smiled, realizing he wasn't the only one who had dealt with her antics. His neighbors clearly knew her reputation, and from the sound of it, she had a long history of causing trouble. But rather than feeling angry, James felt a sense of camaraderie with his fellow Karen survivors. Later that evening, James was relaxing with a cold beer when his phone buzzed again. Another motion alert. This time, the camera captured something entirely unexpected. A handwritten letter stuck to his mailbox. Unlike Karen's previous notes, this one wasn't from her. It was from a neighbor named Tom, who lived a few houses down. The letter read, "Hey James, just wanted to say thanks for sharing your story. We've all had our own run-ins with Karen, and it's nice to see someone stand their ground. If you ever need backup, count me in. By the way, nice pool setup. Flamingo's a nice touch." James laughed, realizing that the incident had unintentionally made him something of a neighborhood hero. He wrote a quick response, thanking Tom for his support, and sent it back with a friendly wave. As the sun set over the lake, James leaned back in his chair, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. What had started as an infuriating experience had turned into something strangely rewarding. He had taken control of the situation, refused to be bullied, and even managed to inject a bit of humor into the ordeal. In the following weeks, life returned to normal. James swam in his pool, enjoyed his evenings by the lake, and occasionally exchanged knowing smiles with neighbors who passed by. The cameras remained in place, but they became more of a precaution than a necessity. Karen didn't make any more appearances, at least not on his property. But James couldn't help but wonder if she was still lurking nearby, waiting for her next opportunity to stir up trouble. He kept his phone close, ready for the next motion alert, just in case. Until then, though, he was content. His pool was his sanctuary once again, and if Karen ever decided to return, he'd be more than ready. After all, life by the lake was full of surprises, and James had learned to roll with the punches, one inflatable flamingo at a time.